By that time, nothing new was being debated. The letters that were already considered authoritative had bubbled to the surface, and the ones that weren't had died off. Not because there was some secret meeting or agenda or power move that was taking place to corral people or correct people. The reality is, it's much messier than that. I mean, it would be a very clear and cut story if that were the case, but the history doesn't tell it that way. And we got to go with what the history says. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Whiskey in the Writings. I'm so glad you're here. If you found us, this is a channel all about just wrestling with the text, wrestling with faith, looking at theology from different lenses, different perspectives, and seeing what we can gain through our questions, through our curiosity, and through the mystery of it all. So that's what we're about here. I'm so glad that you've joined us. Today, we're going to be talking about how the New Testament came to be. And it may surprise you the trajectory that we're going to go down today, because there's a lot of thoughts and a lot of ideas about how this thing came to be what we call a New Testament. So I want to break down for you today just some observations that I think are important to understanding how this text was formed and how it became the thing that we have today in our Bibles. But before we get into that, we're going to be drinking some bourbon, as we do on this channel. And I had a bourbon out for this episode. It's a Bullet malt whiskey. So I'm excited to try that because I've never had it before. But I was talking to my dad before I started recording. He called me, and so we were chatting for a bit. And we were talking about whiskey, and he's like, I've been drinking Four Roses. And I was like, well, I have some Four Roses, and I have a little bit left of Four Roses. So I thought, Dad, if you're watching, I'm going to drink some Four Roses with you. So go grab your Four Roses, pour a drink. And Dad, if this is just a conversation between me and you, I'm very excited to have it. We are finishing this off today. And I couldn't be more happy to finish it off with you, Dad, as you're watching. And we'll just pretend like it's just you and me talking for a little bit. Hope that's okay. For the rest of you that get to listen in to me and my dad talk, my dad lives in Tennessee, so we don't get to see each other very often anymore. I was blessed. My family was blessed to be able to have my dad live here. He's from Alabama. That's where I was born. We grew up in Salt Lake City. And then when I moved to Idaho, he moved back to Alabama. And through the course of years, I got married, and my brother got married. My sister got married. We all started having kids at the right time. And my brother, he lived in the Vancouver area, and my sister still lives in Salt Lake. And so we all had kids in this Pacific Northwest kind of region. And my dad still lived in Alabama. And so we convinced him to move to where the grandkids are. And so he moved to Idaho, just north of where I live, and got some property out there, horses, land. And my kids grew up just playing on the property and shooting guns and riding horses and just living their best life. And so when they got older, my kids got older, as kids do, they kind of stopped going to those places and doing those things traditionally. And so my dad was at a place where he wanted to be back home to where he was familiar, places that the smells and the sights and the sounds and the people that were meaningful to him all his life. And so he moved back to Tennessee. With his beautiful wife and wonderful mother, Linda. Love you so much, Linda, if you're watching. But anyway, so I don't get to see Dad too much. And so we're talking today, just you and me, Dad. I got my Four Roses. This is my the little bit of my single barrel. We've really enjoyed this as a great whiskey. It's a little bit more on the expensive side than your traditional Four Roses. Four Roses seems to have, maybe four tiers. They have their lower end, more accessible Four Roses bourbon. This one is kind of mid to high in their range. Really good, really accessible. It's just a delicious, can't go wrong bourbon. All that to say, we're here. Let's do this here. Here we go. If you got your glass, pour your drink responsibly. Dad, This is for you. I hope you're watching. Well, you said you would, so here we go. Cheers. Okay, so we're talking today about the books of the New Testament, or okay, books isn't even the right word. The letters and the writings. You can classify some of them maybe as books, maybe the biographies you might be able to classify as a book. I still think Revelation is pretty much a letter. I mean, the writing says it's a letter to the 7 churches. So it's this letter that feels like a book because of the back 3/4 of it. Again, the Gospels could probably be a book, what are called ancient biographies. I call them biographies because I think it's more helpful than when we say the Gospels, especially it's a little bit more accessible to people that might not be familiar with the biblical language. Christianese sometimes is used. So I call them biographies. And if I'm getting technical, I'll call them theological biographies, which is simply a term to indicate that these writings that we call the Gospels, these 4 biographies of Jesus, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John, are not biographies in the truest sense that we understand a biography. When you read the life and times of Abraham Lincoln by a famous biographer of the 20th century, you're going to get a very detailed account, maybe some kind of like analysis of their life, but by and large, you're getting details from a sense of like factual, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And you get a sense of that in the Gospels, which is why they are called biographies, but they're ancient in the sense that they have a different way of approaching stories that's different than the way we would tell a story. And then I call them theological biographies just simply because I not only think that they are telling the story of Jesus, but I think that they're telling the story of Jesus through a certain theological framework, which is to say that all 4 Gospels they have an agenda. They're trying to get you to believe something. Primarily, they're trying to get you to believe that Jesus Christ is either the Messiah or the Lord. And those are important things to believe, especially for churches in the mid-1st century that are growing and figuring themselves out and trying to remember and recall the life and sayings of Jesus that have been passed down orally prior to these times. And so they've been combined, they've been shared and formed to help people believe. And so things like, and I've talked about this at length, and so if you're a fan of the channel, I bring this up quite a bit, but you have Luke's account where he's talking to Theophilus. If you read Luke chapter 1, verse 1, he very plainly tells us that he's writing so that Theophilus may believe the things that he had been taught. So he has an agenda. He's trying to get Theophilus to be convinced of the things that he was taught. And so they are theologically have a theological bent to them. Another one that I don't point out too often is in John's gospel, the end of John's gospel, which is an entirely different gospel than what is called the synoptic gospel. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels, which means that they have a similar story pattern, that you read something in Matthew and you're very likely to read that same story, albeit written a little different, in Luke, and the same in Mark. And I can tell you why in a second why that is. But John comes on the scene, and 3/4 of the content in John, in the writing that we call the biography of according to John, the biography of Jesus, 3/4 of that content, the things that John tells us in his gospel, are unique to his gospel, which means 3/4 of the sayings, writings, and stories you can't find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's doing something entirely different, and that's pretty exciting and pretty cool. But I love at the end of John's gospel in chapter 21 and verse 24, you have this little addendum, little note. And it says this: "This is the disciple who testifies about these things and has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. There are many other things that Jesus did, and if every one of them were written down, I suppose the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written." that statement alone tells us that it implies that John specifically chose certain stories for certain reasons. Because at the end of it, he's going, listen, this ain't all the stories. Because if everything that Jesus did was written down and talked about, we wouldn't have enough books. Now, of course, he's exaggerating there, right? The idea here is that John's trying to communicate that these are the things I told you about, and there's a reason why I told you about them, and I testified to them. But listen, there is so much more that you have no idea how much is out there, which is fascinating to think about just for a second. Just think and consider the idea that there are all of these stories floating around about Jesus that may or may not be true, that John is aware of, that he alludes to at the end of his writing. And I just think it's fascinating. I'm not saying that changes what we have in our New Testaments. And I'm not saying that if we found some new little discovery of something that Jesus said that can be corroborated, dated, and seen as something as authoritative, should be involved in our New Testaments. I think at least this is where I'm at today. What we have in our New Testaments is exactly what we should have, which means I actually think that the authors of the New Testament, those who wrote these things down, so we could argue whether or not Mark actually wrote the Gospel of Mark or someone else did, or whether John, which there's a lot of scholarly debate that was it John the disciple that wrote these things, or was it his disciples who wrote these things? Because there was a very popular and widespread school at the time in the early first century called the Johannine school, which disciples of John trained themselves in the teachings that John shared, and that spread. And there were schools for this. Okay, so I'm digressing about that. All that to say, we're going to pause for a second so I can close my door. There's a little bit more light coming in that I would like. Hang tight. I'll edit this later. All right, I'm back. I had to throw the dogs outside too because they were being crazy. Okay, where was I? I was saying that what we have today is what we should have today. I'm confident in that. And I want to talk to you about this reality of, and hopefully I didn't skip over something and didn't finish the thought. But if I did, I'm sorry. Ask me about it in the comment. I can come back to you on it. Let's move on to the topic here. So we're talking about the formation of the 27 writings that we have in what we call a New Testament, or Christians call the New Testament. There's 27 writings that are there. And there are a few things that we could ask about this. So there's a lot of popular conversation and debate about how those writings, those specific 27, were chosen to be formed and a stamp of authority, as if, this is it and we're done. Like, the question can be asked, like, when did the church, or when was it decided that this is it? There's only 27 and we're good, and we've stamped it with the authority of, yep, that's it, and let's move on with our lives. A lot of people want to argue that kind of situation happened. Well, now my glucose alarm is going off, so that's not cool either. Guys, this is not a good recording, is it? Sorry, Dad. Turn it off. We're okay. We're okay. All right. I'm leaving that one in. Okay. So that's just life when you're trying to record. I'll leave that one in. The question is, when were these formed? When was this decided? And there's a popular belief that you may have heard of. It's been circulated online. People kind of throw this out as a gotcha for kind of like, why do you trust the Bible? They'll use statements like, well, it was decided by Constantine at the Council of Nicaea at 325 AD. And they all got together and they accepted the 27 writings, and then they rejected the rest, and anything else was kicked out and called heresy. And that's when it happened. And so it was a whole political thing, and it was all about power, and it was all about money. And, I can go into all the nuances of that. I'll just say this, that is categorically untrue. There is no basis for that belief. And I may be wrong in this, but I think I'm right that idea got popularized in the early 2000s by a writing, maybe that was the late 90s, but I think it was the early 2000s. A writer, Dan Brown, wrote a book called The Da Vinci Code. And in this book, they made it into a famous movie. Tom Hanks is in it. But in the book, he, tells this story, this fictional story about this character. And this character finds out that at the Council of Nicaea, Constantine brought all the bishops together and forced what was the New Testament and rejected out other popular writings for power reasons to create more power for himself. Okay, so I think that's where that idea, and if I'm wrong, maybe it originated earlier and Dan Brown didn't make it up and just popularized it. Could be either or. The point is, a lot of people think that. In fact, I still get questions like that. Well, wasn't the New Testament formed at the Council of Nicaea under Constantine? No. Just Google it. I mean, I hate saying Google it because you can get all sorts of crazy answers, but for this one, there's just no truth to it. Okay, so if that's not true, then when did these writings come together and become a formal set of letters that we use to guide us as Christians today? Well, I want to start with the reality is this. There was no council that got together with all the writings on the table and went, I'll choose this one, I'll choose this one, I'll choose this one. There was never a moment in history where that happened. There was a council that took place in the 4th century, I believe it was the 4th century, that put a stamp of approval on what was already known as authoritative texts, okay? Which is very different than saying they picked and chose. That council that took place essentially said, yeah, this is good. Let's settle with this. There wasn't a big, well, what about this letter? And what about that letter? Those debates happened for sure. In fact, one of those debates was circulating around the 3rd century when Constantine was coming to power. There was a writer named Eusebius. And Eusebius wrote in his Ecclesiastical History of the Church, it's this brilliant writing where he chronicles the beginning, the inception of the church on into his day in the 3rd century. And so he's telling about all these stories, and a lot of the information that we have between the 1st century and the 3rd century come from his writings. Like, he's quoting letters and writings that he has in his possession that we don't have today. Like, they've been lost in history. So it's a very fascinating writing because he'll be like, oh yeah, I have this letter here, or I have this writing here, and so said this, and here it is, and he quotes it. But we don't have that. Like, all we have is what he says he's quoting. So it's a fascinating writing, and I encourage you to check it out. But in Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History of the Church, he has a section where he begins to talk about the writings that are the designation of certain writings. And he designates them in 3 different categories. He calls them authoritative. The second category is disputed. And the 3rd category is rejected. And what's fascinating is that when he begins to put certain letters and certain things in certain categories, he'll list things sometimes in multiple categories. So for instance, he's saying the writing Revelation is listed both in disputed categories and rejected categories, which simply just says there were some church communities in certain regions that saw the writing of Revelation as not authoritative for them, and they didn't have it in their collection of writings. And yet there were some churches that did. So Eusebius is able to put Revelation in the same category as disputed as rejected. Now, what does that tell us? Okay, so that tells us from in and around the 3rd century, there were debates happening within Christian communities that were discussing what writings that we have in our New Testament are what we might call authoritative. Now, that's different than inspired. The idea of inspiration is a later dialogue that took place, albeit influenced from earlier Christian writers, but not formalized until a little later. When early Christians thought of writings in communities, they thought of them as what is authoritative, what is useful for teaching, what is useful for correcting, what is useful for the ability to lead a community towards right living in Jesus and his kingdom. And so some communities had letters that they didn't find as authoritative. They didn't have a place of authority in that community. Not because they were bad, not because they thought they were evil or suspect, but simply because they just weren't an authoritative piece of literature in that community. That's how they treated things back then. And so there was dialogue. So in the 3rd century, what this tells us, historically speaking, this tells us that there was conversations happening. Eusebius saw it as something worth addressing in his history. Like, hey, these are conversations that are happening. And so that's an important thing to think about, that there were these letters, all of which, and there are other writings. Okay, so let's be clear. As the 1st century begins to close, there are a lot of writing. Christianity's kind of on this trend of like up, a little bit of down because of persecution, up, down, persecution, things like that are happening. And communities are forming their ways of liturgy and worship. They're learning how to practice Eucharist. They're discussing the value of what Jesus said those things were, what Paul taught them that they should be, and writings are happening. And there are outside voices that were not eyewitnesses that are actually chiming into that conversation, and they're writing things themselves. And so you have certain writings like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, these writings that are attributed to popular New Testament figures, but were not actually written by those figures. And then those are being passed around. So these aren't secret, unknown things. Sometimes it's like, oh, the hidden gospel, the gospel they tried to keep out. Well, here's the reality. In the 3rd century, before the Council of Nicaea even existed, or these sorts of things were pulled together by Constantine, Eusebius is telling us about these writings. And he's already letting us know that these things have been rejected from the beginning, which is a fascinating thing that anyone comes to you and it's like tries to hype you into this, like, well, they kept certain things out. The earliest Christians that were closest to the stories of Jesus, either through eyewitness, secondhand witness, thirdhand witness, these stories have been passed down, had an ability to know, no, these things didn't happen. And these are outside voices trying to chime into our community and have influence. And they rejected them. There's nothing crazy about that. There's nothing secretive about that. There's nothing to fear about that. I have the Gospel of Thomas on my shelf. I've read it. It's not scary. It's not spooky. It's just a writing that happened to be in and around the time that these other New Testament writings are happening. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that it's authoritative or inspired or should have been put in, but was kicked out. Okay. That's a lot to say there. I want to jump a little bit further down though. Okay. So let's talk about this. There are people, because I'll get to a point of like how we know these things are what they should be, or we have what we should have, but I got to get you to that point. So Dad, bear with me. I hope this isn't too much or I'm talking too fast. But the reality is that these writings that we consider authoritative in these collection of 27 were already being recognized as authoritative way early on. So the earliest Christians knew what texts ought to be shared, copied, passed on to other communities. And then what we find is that the 2nd and 3rd generation Christians begin to quote these writings as authoritative. And that's an important distinction, that when you have leaders in like 150 AD and 200 AD and going back, and they're not citing new information, but they reflect back and quote those stories or those Paul letters or John letters or Peter letters or the Gospels, and they quote them to the communities they're trying to witness to. That is telling us the value that they saw in those texts, that those leaders thought them to be authoritative. Let's give you 3 examples. Okay. In and around the turn of the 2nd century, in 160 to around 175, there was a church leader named Tatian. And Tatian is very popular for doing something very interesting, something that probably a lot of people have tried. In fact, I have my good friend Joel told me about this the other day. He actually tried to do this. Hate to break it to you, Joel. Tatian first attempted this in the 160s. But what he tried to do is, so Tatian was a Christian who took the texts seriously, and he took the Gospels seriously. So at this time, the 4 Gospels are in circulation and known and accepted as authoritative texts on the life of Jesus. Because we know this because in the 160s, this guy Tatian has these 4 Gospels. He is recognizing the differences that exist in them, how Mark can tell a story that's different than Luke, and Luke tells it different than Matthew, and Matthew, says it, and John doesn't even address it, but John's telling a different story in his own way. And sometimes the stories have Jesus going into the city and doing a miracle. Sometimes it has Jesus coming out of the city and doing a miracle. And the question is, which one is it, right? Tatian is applying a very Greek Western mindset to the text. He's trying to harmonize them, and he tried to do it. In fact, he created a writing called the Diatessaron. And you can Google this, the Diatessaron. This is a writing where he tried to harmonize all 4 Gospels into one coherent story, where all the pieces fall together. And what's crazy about that is that Diatessaron died off. It didn't last, which tells us he essentially failed at it. He couldn't do it. And whatever he did produce wasn't compelling enough for the early church to accept it as something worth having in their texts. And so the Diatessaron falls out of favor and is no longer used. So what does that tell us? It tells us a couple things. One, it tells us that the 4 Gospels are already around and in circulation and well read enough for someone like Tatian to pick them up and try to harmonize them, which means that you can date the writings prior probably to the mid 170s, 180s. Like these letters are earlier because we have this writing where this guy, Tatian, wrote this thing where he tried to harmonize these Gospels. So that is an important thing to say, that these writings are already being viewed as important to the church community and the life of the church. So that's a really cool kind of example. But let's go back a little bit further. Next, you have this guy named Polycarp. Now, Polycarp is an interesting figure because according to church tradition, Polycarp was a disciple of John, Gospel of John, the disciple John. So the tradition goes like this. John was probably a very young disciple. They were all pretty young, but John might have been the youngest of all of those that were of the disciples. I hate to say 12 because I think the idea of the 12 disciples is more figurative than it is literal. Even though there were 12, there were more than 12, and the Gospels don't shy away from that. All that to say, I digress. So that John, as he became older and was in pastoral ministry, he had disciples. And church tradition has it that Polycarp was one of those disciples. And he was in around the 110 to like 140 in that AD. So he's even going further back than Tatian in the story. And he has the epistle to the Philippians. So it's a letter to the Philippians. And in it, like this writing, he is quoting, he's quoting 1st and 2nd Timothy. He's quoting the Gospels. He's quoting a lot of Philippians in his writing to the Philippians. So again, we have an early dated disciple of John who is quoting, not himself, but quoting these other writings as authoritative pieces of literature by which ought to influence and have authority in their life. So again, we're seeing from the very early inception of Christianity, the identification of what's important and not important, okay? But let's go back even further. You have a guy named Ignatius. And Ignatius of Antioch, he wrote a bunch of letters, and he wrote in around the 107 to 110, so roughly in a contemporary or adjacent to Polycarp. But he is writing, and he's quoting Paul's letters. He's quoting the Gospels. He alludes to gospel tradition and Pauline epistles. He is prioritizing these texts as authoritative in as early as 107 to 110. So right at the turn of the century, guys, these first and second generation Christians are looking at the texts that we call our New Testaments and quoting them as authoritative to the communities that they're ministering to. That tells us something. That tells us that from the very beginning, the early church communities had a way to distinguish what was important and or not important in this corpus of writings that existed at this time. They had a way to distinguish between things that were very authoritative. Like the Gospels were never disputed. Paul's writings, most all of Paul's writings, there are some that are disputed, but most all of them were undisputed. Some of Peter's writings, undisputed. James' writings was undisputed. It was not popular, but it was not a disputed, spurious piece of writing. All that to say, the early church had a way to distinguish between what was important or authoritative for the formation of the church as a whole versus what was not. And those are just three people that we can trace back that aren't considered eyewitnesses. But then you get into the eyewitnesses. And this is where I think this gets really cool. That even in your New Testament, Dad, if you want to turn there, there's the writing called 2 Peter. So this is at the back of your New Testament. You've got 2 Peter, you got 1, 2, 3 John, you got Jude, you got Revelation. So it's in the very back there. And chapter 3 of Peter's second letter. Now, one could argue, and some scholars do, I don't, but some scholars do, that maybe Peter, the Peter that we think of, the chicken crows and you'll deny me 3 times, Peter, didn't write that, didn't write this. I tend to believe that he did. I think there's good reason for it. And so I tend to just go, the simplest explanation makes the most sense, and let's go with that. So, but in the third chapter of 2 Peter, verse 14, let me read it. This is incredible. And you can underline this in your Bible. It says, "Therefore, dear friends, since you are waiting for these things, strive to be found at peace without spot or blemish when you come into his presence, and regard the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as also our dear brother Paul wrote to you, according to the wisdom given to him, speaking of these things in all his letters. Some of these things in these letters are hard to understand, things the ignorant and the unstable twist to their own destruction." And so what's powerful here is right here in a writing in the New Testament, you have the acknowledgement of other writings in the New Testament. And Peter is affirming what Paul is saying. He's saying it's hard to understand. And, you take some time in Romans for a little bit, and you'll understand what Peter's talking about. Peter, which is fascinating that Peter's, the follower of Jesus is going, yeah, some of the things Paul says is it's hard to follow. All that to say, Peter was aware of the writings of Paul, which are the earliest in the New Testament. So I know you have the Gospels start 1, 2, 3, 4 in your New Testament. Those come later. the writings of Paul are actually predate the gospel writings. We have them in our New Testament primarily because when the New Testament was being translated into Latin and in languages outside of that, you would take the books that had the most. They were collected, but they were always arranged by least to most words outside of Revelation at the back there. But and then they were grouped together. You have the Gospels, you have the prison letters, Pauline epistles, you have the apocalyptic literature with Revelation. So you have them grouped in genre and then sometimes in order of length. Okay, so none of that matters. All I'm trying to say is that even in the New Testament, you have the affirmation of authoritative texts that happen to be Paul's, which is what we actually have. Okay. Whew. That's a lot to say this. And I haven't been drinking very much of my whiskey. Here's what I find is fascinating about this, Dad. When we want to ask the question, how did this all come together? Sometimes we want this neat and perfect picture of a bunch of smart dudes that we all trust, made a decision, and we all just went, hey, we're good to go with that. And no one had a problem, and no one had debates, and no one had a discussion about it. The opposite is in fact true. The formation of what we have as our New Testament was a very muddled process. There were churches in Africa, Northern Africa, that had certain letters and didn't have certain letters. Acknowledged certain things and didn't. There are churches in Asia Minor that had certain aspects of what they agreed to. There were, churches in Greece. I mean, so as these churches started to explode in the world, it's a very complicated process. And here's the thing that we need to recognize about this. The things that bubbled to the surface, it was a communal decision. There was never one person in one place that said, this is it, and if you don't like it, get out. It was a communal conversation where those letters, those writings that were the most shared. So there were certain criteria that New Testament scholars recognize through church tradition as the basis by which certain things would be considered authoritative, because at a certain point decisions have to be made, right? So let me just share a few of them. One of the things that was important to people that wanted to believe something to be authoritative is that it had to be written at the time that eyewitnesses could verify it. Okay, so for instance, Mark was not a disciple of Jesus. He was a companion of Peter. So Mark's gospel is the testimony that was shared to him through Peter, whether they traveled together. One of the historical traditions is that when he was in Rome preaching, he was called to come back. He and Mark were in Rome. He was called to come back to Jerusalem, and the people in Rome didn't want him to leave without leaving the story of Jesus because they didn't want to forget. This is told again in Eusebius's ecclesiastical history of the church. And so the story goes that Mark, his companion, wrote down the things that Peter said and left it with the church in Rome. Okay, so that's a tradition that talks about the formation of Mark's gospel, or we might call Peter's gospel. But the idea here is that it was written at a time that eyewitnesses of Jesus's life could have looked at what Mark wrote and went, "That's not true. That didn't happen." So it needed to be written at a time where there was verifiable evidence. And this is important because even in 1 Corinthians 15, and I've shared this in my Easter videos, but in 1 Corinthians 15, there's this powerful thing that Paul says when he's talking about the resurrection. And he says this. So he's talking about the appearance of Jesus. He appears to Cephas, then to 12, then he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at one time. So he's like, he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then to like 500 people at one time, Jesus shows up. Imagine that for a second. That would have been incredible. And then he says this, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep, which is to say they've died. So it's as if Paul in that moment when he writes this, that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6. It's as if Paul's kind of egging on the reader there to go like, if you doubt me, go ask them, because some of them are still alive. You can go talk to them today. Like, they'll tell you the truth, right? So this is kind of the thing that happens, is that these eyewitnesses, these people that could verify, corroborate the story. So that's one of the criteria that would cause something to be considered authoritative, because it's more likely to be true if it passed the test of an eyewitness giving its stamp of approval. So another concept to consider in this, again, not to diverge into the nerd, but the gospel, the synoptic gospels. So I said earlier that the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and they're called synoptics because they share a similar thread in story, whereas John, it differs so greatly. But those synoptics are very fascinating because scholars have been able to see a thorough line through all of them, and it all hinges on Mark, which is to say this. What you see in Matthew and Luke, when they tell a story that is also in Mark, they tend to keep Mark's version, but maybe add a little more detail to it. But they keep the same thing. And that tells scholars that most likely Mark's gospel was written first, and Matthew and Luke knew about it. And they used Mark's gospel as the framework, as an outline of sorts, to write theirs. And then they add in stories along the way. It's very, very fascinating. So, and that's a whole other discussion in and of itself. But what that tells you is that these stories were shared and seen as authoritative. Matthew and Luke, by their very borrowing of Mark's story and tradition, tells you that they're essentially putting their stamp of approval on Mark's versions of the events. So all I had to say, it was this early adoption based off of eyewitness. Another way that they developed a criteria of what is authoritative or not is the spreading of these stories. So, so for instance, 1 Corinthian and 2 Corinthian are more accurately should be the 2 Corinthians and 3 Corinthians, because there was a 1 Corinthians that we don't have. It didn't get reproduced. So whatever happened, this is how this seems to go down. Paul writes them 1 Corinthians, not our 1 Corinthians, but a 1 Corinthian letter. They write back to him and they are rebuttaling him. They're like arguing against him. So then Paul writes them back to refute them. And that's what we have called our 1 Corinthians. So what's fascinating about that is that why didn't the first letter in the 3 letters get passed on? Why don't we have that today? Well, for whatever reason, it might not have been valuable to the broader community of the church. So they only preserved, copy, and passed around the 2nd letter and the 3rd letter, which we now call 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. So again, it had to be something that the community itself saw as value, copied, and passed it on to other communities. There's more than I have time to get into, but those are some of the ways in which authority was determined in these writings. So by time the 3rd and 4th century come around, let's just say the 4th century, when the stamp of approval was given on the 27 New Testament writings, by that time, nothing new was being debated. The letters that were already considered authoritative had bubbled to the surface, and the ones that weren't had died off. Not because there was some secret meeting or agenda or power move that was taking place to corral people or correct people. The reality is, it's much messier than that. I mean, it would be a very clear and cut story if that were the case, but the history doesn't tell it that way. And we got to go with what the history says. The history says that it was a complicated, long debated discussion that lasted decades, by which the letters that we have today emerged to the top as authoritative for the wider church community, by which we use them today. So when I say that the New Testament that we have today is the Bible that God wanted us to have, is because it went through that process of people asking questions, pushing, debating, arguing, and what came to the surface is what should have come to the surface. The most authoritative texts to lead us into wise living as God's people on God's earth. And that's just my take. Well, it's not just my take. A lot of other people are smarter than me take that position too. Maybe that doesn't answer your question. Like, how do we have all of this today? And I think that's my point. Like, sometimes we want like, okay, well, tell me what date and what time that we went, these are all good. And there's just not one. And we just have to be okay with that. The reality of the history is that there's not a moment in time where all of that decision was made. It was a community of God fearing, kingdom living people that wanted to live God's way on God's earth and did so faithfully by using the texts that were shared with them because they were the most authoritative testimonies to what it means to be a follower of Jesus in their time and forever time. And so what we have today is, I think, what we should have. And for me, if I want to go that next level to, well, what's inspired by God? I think that is inspiration. The fact that we can have that kind of confidence through the history that we see, that what we have today is what emerged to be the truth of what was the most authoritative. I think that that's a testimony to how God works in the lives of people, which is to say God never, search the scriptures. God works slowly, methodically. And you'll love this analogy, Dad, because it's a Southern one. And I remember hearing it in years ago in Alabama, attending church, when the preacher said, God, our God's a crock-pot God. He's not microwavable. And that, man, I'll tell you what, there's certain things that stick in my mind, but that's one of them. And I remember the preacher saying that in a Southern church in Demopolis, Alabama. Our God's a crock-pot God. He's not microwavable. And that's the story of the text and in our lives, right? When's the last time God ever moved super fast in our lives? He doesn't. He takes sometimes decades to see things happen. And maybe that's more of a fault of our own because we're too thick-headed to follow his wise leading. But the Lord is patient and he is kind and he is good. And what we have today, we can trust it. And I think we can trust it because of the mess, not because it's clean, not because it's straightforward, not because it has a stamp of this like perfect formation, but because it actually exemplifies the way God moves in the world, which is messy and sometimes difficult and complicated. And so what comes out of that is maturity. And what we come out of in the New Testament is an authoritative text that I think we can read with confidence, that it has the ability to lead us wisely as God's people on God's earth. So there you have it, Dad. Thanks for watching. And also, if someone else watched too, super rad that you did. I'm glad that you did. We have a subscribe button on the channel, so I'd love for it if you helped us out with that. Share it with someone that you might think that this is valuable to, that has struggled with the confidence and what we have in the New Testament. If that's someone you know, share them the video. Let them know about it. There'll be a podcast they can listen to on Wednesday that's coming out. But otherwise, thanks for watching. I'm so glad that you tuned in again to me just rambling about things that I love to talk about while I drink some whiskey. So until next time, cheers.